With you all tonight. Just a quick intro to our guest speaker tonight. It's a real privilege on a midweek to have a guest speaker come all the way from South London. I was down there today actually getting time with Mike and Tess Fontaine were down there. It's great to be down that part of the world. Many of us have known James for years. He's a top architect amongst many things. He's actually working in West London at the moment. The best place, the best buildings I think in West London. And it's a real privilege. We were discussing the leadership, other things we want to teach on, have lessons on. And James sent us this ream of list of many things that he's wanting to feed the church with. He just really wants to serve the church, not just in the south side, but around London and the UK with just different focuses. And one of them jumped out to us was just on grief and on troubled times that we could all go through. Even in Dave's Pray reflects on that. And so James has put together a class on Job, from the book of Job, and on the steadfastness of Job. So let's give him our full big West attention, and let's welcome James Thomas up to the mic.
Thank you so much. It is so good to be here and to see so many friends, old faces that I know really, really well. And I mean, it's great to see so many of you here, especially with a wedding, I believe.
That's right.
Saturday, yeah. That's amazing to see everyone. And I love the welcome. Thank you, Dave. And it's such a good verse, and it feels really appropriate to be talking about peace before this lesson, and also in preparation for with all the things that are going on in this country and around the world as well. So thank you for that. This is a lesson on grief and mourning and resilience from the book of Job. And there we go. And I thought it's great to be. I was in the West. I visited about 6 weeks, 2 months ago, just briefly, and it was so good to see you then. But it's been a long while since before that, maybe 10 years since I've been in the West before that. So I thought I would share a little bit about me. So there we are. There is Amanda, my son JJ, my daughter Millie, and that's our zoo. And seems to continue to grow. And I'm been in various ICOC congregations, baptized in 91, and been in the South, various congregations in South London, different names, since 93. So I feel comfortable south of the river, but it's really nice to come north. Thank you for the welcome. And I've been focusing, as kind of intimated, on teaching. It's kind of for about 3 years, since Mohan actually kind of suggested it. So thank you for that suggestion, Mohan, and the UK and London teaching. It's been a great journey, and I'm very happy to talk to anyone. Tonight's class is how we react to grief and loss and hard times. And we're going to look, we're a Bible-loving church, aren't we? And we believe that all truth comes from the Bible. Yeah. And so we're going to look at the truth and the wisdom on that from the book of Job, and a little bit from the book of Lamentations as well, if we have time. And the topic about steadfastness comes actually from James 5:11 in the New Testament. Behold, we consider those blessed who remained steadfast. You have heard of the steadfastness of Job. So even in the New Testament, we're encouraged to look back at Job for this elusive topic of steadfastness. And a bit about this topic is also about mental health as well, which remains. And so I'm not a mental health professional in any way. I was trained by a dear, recently departed Tim Summerlin, I don't know if you know of him, who in the Grief Journey, which is an amazing program that they do, and it's done. We have a program we do that program in the South Side from time to time, which is amazing. And I've also been trained as a mental health first aider in work, and probably more relevantly, I've spoken about the challenges I've been through, both in the South Side and at work. And I'll be speaking about Job. I'll be sharing about the extraordinary challenges that went through the life of Job, but also some of the challenges that face me as well. And I appreciate that is a fairly challenging topic, so I really thank you West for inviting me to talk about it. And it's particularly hard on a Thursday night after a long day at work. I'm out with Ed, my old friend, for a drink, and we were talking about that. Paul says in 2 Corinthians, if I must boast, I will boast of the things that show my weakness. And on this topic, I hope it will help if I share in some of my weaknesses. Right. So, a lot of us have had great loss in different areas. And for example, I mean, in the last few months, I've been looking at this book of Lamentations, and that brought up some feelings I didn't know were there. Feelings of grief about the end of the Riverside sector. The Riverside was a sector in the southwest, and it merged, but it, you know, and Ed and Jackie, we were there together. But that was a very, and this is 12 years ago, and I'm reading this book of the Bible, and suddenly these feelings well up from 12 years ago, which I thought, I didn't even know I felt those feelings as well. And I think that's an example of grief. I like to consider the concept of grief a little bit. Here is the psychologist's definition of grief. And that doesn't mean it's bad, just because some psychologists, I helped prepare some of the work on this class with a Christian psychotherapist and a Christian psychologist in the South Side, Lorna Jarvis and Sarah Farrell. And they were amazed at how much, you know, as they studied out how many of the key principles of medical psychology come out of the Bible, and actually just, they flow. The truth is the truth. But this is the key medical definition of grief. The conflicting feelings caused by change or an end to a familiar pattern of behaviour. A normal and natural response to loss. Unresolved grief are emotions that have not been communicated and expressed. And I think, and I was talking about earlier, that the Riverside, 12 years it's been sitting there, that's an unresolved, uncommunicated grief that I didn't know was there, but is there. And the trouble is you get stuck. People get stuck with unresolved grief, and that then hinders us. If we just try and bury it and put it behind us, it can hinder us as we try to move forward. And we all want to be effective. We don't want to just sit around for time. We all want to be as effective as you possibly can be for God. And if we have grief on something which isn't resolved, we can get stuck there and stuck in a bad place. And it can come out in a negative and weird way. And I had that when I was talking about it. Even last night, preparing this class, I started thinking about it, going through my head. And I was up till 1:30. And then I was up again at 4:30 in the morning. And I came downstairs, and fortunately we got a lovely beagle that you saw there, and we had some good time together on the sofa. Don't tell my wife she was on the sofa with me. But that was comforting in a way. But that was this grief coming up and welling up from this topic. And we look at Job. We consider those blessed who remain steadfast. You've heard of the steadfastness of Job. We look for Job and other people in the Bible as examples of how we can be freed in these ways. Now, steadfastness, it's there twice. Who remains steadfast? You've heard of the steadfastness of Job. But what is this word? It's not a word I use. I don't know about you. Maybe my English vocabulary is a bit narrow, but I don't use the word steadfast at all. And then with the teaching thing, the biblical teaching thing, I'm also doing a master's at the ICOC University, the Rocky Mountain School of Ministry and Theology, which is awesome. It's amazing we have a university. I'm doing a master's there. And I did a course recently with Steve Kennard on Greek, which completely, Coney Greek, not modern Greek, and that blew my head a bit. So a little bit of Greek. I think just a tiny bit of Greek occasionally can be useful. We're not going to do lots, just a tiny little bit of Greek can be helpful. And here we have the word. This is the word hypomonon, which is a patient, enduring, endurance or steadfastness. So that's the Greek word which is used there in the New Testament. Now, Bible translators are amazing, outstanding, and your NIV or ESV or the version is great, and that probably translates that as steadfast. That's the best word for it. So what does the steadfast mean? Well, steadfast is an old English word for the scholars around us. Stead and fast, meaning place, stead, and faced or fast, firmly fixed. So we could picture somebody firmly fixed in place who is not going to move. Something like this. You know, Iron Man, Thor and Captain America, totally outclassed, and they stand there and they're not going to move. You know, they are, at this point, Thanos is not going to move past them. And, you know, it's a great example. So that's an example, I'd say, about what this word steadfast, what we're trying to learn from the Bible, what we're trying to learn from Job is to be steadfast like these guys. And the Greek bit is probably a little bit extra on top of it. The main thing is this, you know, firmly fixed like Iron Man against Thanos, not going to move. But there's also a time element, I would say, in the Greek, you know, that, it talks about not moving. I like this song. I think this gives a little bit about it. In Christ alone, my hope is found. He is my light, my strength, my song. This cornerstone, this solid ground, firm through the fiercest drought and storm. So Jesus stands there. He is steadfast. He is not going anywhere, whatever happens. And that's in time. There's a time element that you're going to stand against whatever happens through drought and storm and on and on and on. Jesus immemorial. And that's, I think, what the definition is of the steadfast. That's what we want to learn from Job. Let's talk some background to the book of Job. So, there was a man in the land of Uz, and that man was blameless and upright, one who feared God and turned away from evil. So this is us. It's probably about here on Google Maps. It's about there, you know, and it appears in the Bible quite a lot of times. So he's from here, and there were born to him 7 sons, and he had lots of sheep, and lots of donkeys, and lots of servants. He was not only a godly man, but the wealthiest man of the East, you know, it says about him. So he's sort of like, I don't know how to say this. Well, I was going to say Elon Musk, but with, in terms of wealth, okay? Hard to find somebody. In fact, that's it. You know, there is an example like that. I don't think, you know, today. But he was an extraordinary person. And he was also a righteous man. Job 1 says his sons used to go and hold a feast. And I think it means on their birthdays, on his day, they would do that. And when the days were over, Job would send for them and consecrate them. Interesting. And he would offer burnt offerings to them. And that's kind of interesting, because what we know about Job is he actually wasn't a Jew. He wasn't part of an Israelite. He wasn't part of the chosen people. He was a God-fearing man outside of that, which is extraordinary. It also, when was it written? Because he couldn't have been offering those sacrifices, people would say, after the start of the sacrifice at the foot of Moses, at the foot of Mount Sinai with Moses and the tabernacle. So it had to be before that. So somewhere between Abraham, about 2000 BC, and Moses and Sinai, about 1200 AD. Maybe about 1700 BC, which makes it the oldest book in the Bible. Now, there might be the first bit of Genesis, which is older than that book, you know, but probably the oldest book of the Bible. And there are some other literature from around that area, which, in particular, the complaints of Kakeperson from Egypt, and then some stuff from Babylon as well, which actually is quite similar. And even maybe it feels like they copied, the later ones copied the book of Job in what they did. So there's literature, wisdom literature there as well. And Martin Luther King described it as one of the greatest literary and theological compositions of the ancient world, which is nice. So that's some background. It's one of the wisdom books, in particular Proverbs, Job and Ecclesiastes. And then the New Testament, James and the Sermon on the Mount are great as well. There are other wisdom books, and Mohan has done a great talk a while back on the wisdom literature of the Old Testament. For more about that. Let's look at what happened to Job. It's an interesting story. There was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came among them. The Lord said to Satan, "From where have you come?" Satan answered the Lord, "From going to and fro on the earth, and from walking up and down on it." So this is an extraordinary insight into Satan and heaven and God. Like, wow, what's going on here? Satan has gone up to heaven and is talking with God. Here's a painting of that. You see Satan in the bottom right corner coming up to God, and everyone's kind of going, what in the world is going on here? And the next verse, the Lord said to Satan, "Have you considered my servant Job? There is
Heart
none
rate
like
zone
him on the earth,
1.5.
a blameless and upright man who fears God and turns away from evil." You know, that's pretty good, isn't it? You know, there is none like him from Ed, the only best person in London. You know, it'd be a good thing for God to say. You know, a good thing for anyone to say. And Job responds. Then Satan answered the Lord and said, "Does Job fear God for no reason? You've put a hedge around him and his house and all that he has on every side." And there's some encouragement in that God does put a hedge around his people. Not all the time, but he does do it. And you know, he does do it. And then the next verse. "But stretch out your hand and touch all he has, and he will curse you to your face, says Satan. And the Lord said to Satan, "Behold, what he has is in your hand, and against him do not stretch out your hand." So Satan went out from the presence of the Lord. And everything that the Sabaeans took the oxen and the donkeys, the fire of God burned up the sheep, the Chaldeans took the camels, all of his wealth disappeared overnight. Just everything he had. And I want to kind of like, I was thinking, how can we relate to this? I have to say, this is a book from 1700 BC, 3,700 years ago. How can we take this and make it equivalent? Well, how would you feel? Or how did you feel if you lost your job? Or your possessions? One of the toughest experiences I ever had is in 2007. I was fired. Mohan remembers this, I think. I was fired from the company that I had co-founded with my old boss, and I put my money into it, and it did really well. And then one day, they shut me out, and it was like I was devastated, you know, financially as well as emotionally. It was really hard. I'm not joking. You know, it was really traumatic experience. You know, and then so there is where the Chaldeans and the Sabaeans came from. Yeah, so which makes sense. And then Satan has another go. "Your sons and daughters were eating and drinking, and behold, a great wind came across the wilderness and struck the four corners of the house, and it fell upon the young people, and they are dead." This is a family loving. We know how Job loved his family and dedicated them, and they died. I mean, it's very, very brutal and horrific. How does that relate? You know, some of us have known the devastation of a child. A child leaving God is very hard, indeed. Or the death of a loved one, and it is really hard. And I'd like to tell you a bit about my nephew, David. So I have two sisters with two nephews and three nieces, and David was the first of those. There he is. Yeah, a long time ago. We have quite a lot of family gatherings together at my parents and near there. We used to go to the curry house at the end of the road, was our kind of thing. And David, as he grew up, was really easy to talk to. He was horrible as a little kid, but he grew up to be a really lovely young man. And I would always work out to sit next to him, because we would just talk and we would hog the conversation together. And he was always talking about the adventures of. He got into selling high-class watches as well, and he got celebrating, went wing walking, or he'd go off cliff jumping. And he was always really interested in what I was doing as well, and we would just talk about adventures. And, oh, there you go. That's it. And one day in 2014, I got a phone call that he was in hospital. And he'd gone to a party, and they'd taken some ecstasy at the party, and him and a friend had a very bad reaction to that. And he had, a few days later, he'd gone home and he had hung himself. Oh. And I went down, I was on Blackfriars Bridge when I got the phone call, and I just didn't know what to do. I called Mo, didn't I? I called you up. I just didn't know what to do. I was totally like, what's going on? And I just left, and I went down there, drove down, and sat outside the hospital. And it was a weird situation with his dad, and I wasn't allowed in to start with. But we went in, and he was just there, and he lying there, and he had tubes going in because he'd been out without oxygen. They got to the house, and they'd cut him down, but he hadn't had oxygen for a long time. And so he was there. To start with, they thought that he might recover, but then he had a bleed with a fit on him. And 3 days later, they took the machine off, and he died. We had a funeral, hundreds of people at the funeral, and I didn't want, I was a pallbearer of my 14-year-old son, and I was very focused on the rest of the family and trying to keep that together. I didn't grieve or mourn in any way for what happened. And then I got into this really weird relationship with death after that. When someone died, I wouldn't go to the funeral, even close friends. And if someone's on TV, I would walk out of the room if it was on. And then this grief journey thing. Tim Summon's The Grief Journey. It's a book and it's a program. And you go through it, and it's quite. I'm not going to let you read this because it's got. But it's amazing. And at the end of that, I wrote 2 letters to David. So one of those was me apologising for why I didn't step in, why I wasn't there when his dad left, and why I wasn't better. And the other one was bizarre, how I wished he had been more open with his life. Well, I thought we had this great friendship, and I was like, why didn't he tell me what's going on? And he wrote those letters, and it really helped, and I love my nephew, David, he's amazing. It really is extraordinary. I love to talk about it. And and I went to the program with Ian, and in Luke 13 verse 6 it says, "Should not this woman, a daughter of Abraham, whom Satan has kept bound for 18 long years, be set free?" And I feel like the grief journey and with David, I'm set free. That's those binds are gone. I can talk about him and remember all the wonderful things about him. I just felt like Satan kept me bound for 7 long years. I was bent over, and I'd never been to David's grave. It was too hard to find out where it was, actually. It's bizarre. But 2nd October, 2 years, a year and a half ago, I went there. And with my sister, his mum, and my other sister, we got some champagne. It would have been his 30th birthday. And we celebrated champagne. Good champagne. And balloons and flowers and all that stuff. It was great. And since then, I'm able to grieve in a wholesome way. So when our dear brother Ian Williams died last year, I was able to celebrate his life and the way that we should do, in a much wholesome way. So the death of a loved one is something really traumatic, and we can learn from Job and other parts of the Bible. There are other things, there's health. The Lord said to Satan, "Have you considered my servant Job? There's none like him." And Satan answered, "Skin for skin, all that a man has he will give up for his life. But stretch out your hand and touch his bone." So Satan had free rein. and struck Job with loathsome sores, and Job sat there scraping the sores with a bit of pottery. It's a pretty disgusting picture, isn't it? How can we relate to that? To be honest, I feel quite blessed in this area. I know many people, many of you, who have got far more physical challenges than I have. I did break my leg. I got a piece of metalwork in my left femur, and I was in a wheelchair for a bit, and that was really miserable. So I can relate a little bit. And I did put on 20 kilograms in 2003 when lots of other weird stuff was going on and I was comfort eating. And it took me 17 years to get that off. Though that's as far as I go. No, those aren't very good relations. I know many of you have got far more, and my wife has had some fairly, extreme health challenges. But that's another area we can really go from challenge and loss, not being able to do things because of our health can be really hard. Difficult questions. Why does it happen? Why does God allow this to happen? Why isn't the hedge there all the time? And I think, does Job fear God for no reason? This is, is there a hedge? Why do bad things happen to good people, to disciples? And that's a big question, we were talking about
Heart rate zone 1.9.
Big. And in brief, this is my view of it. Why do we suffer? Sin of others, very often. Very, very often the sin of others. Our own sin. A question mark. Creation is fall from the fall. I'm not sure about this. I used to think this. Now I'm questioning it. God disciplines us. We know that from Hebrews 12. God helps us to grow. James 1. Our godly response gives God glory. That's what it says in John 9. We come to know Christ through that. Without suffering, there is no joy. Isn't that a strange one? I think there's truth in that. And after great victory, always seems to come challenge. I don't know why. I'm going to ask that one of God. Why did Job suffer? Of these, well, the sin of others, it helped him to grow, and his godly response gave God glory. So I think you look at that and you think, well, maybe those are three reasons. How can we know why? I think very often we don't know why we go through tough times for years, decades afterwards. And I think actually the biblical wisdom books are a good thing to look at. Go and look at those books. They have different forms of wisdom. The wisdom of Proverbs is very different from Job and for Ecclesiastes. They're for people in different places. And going through a hard time in one, Job might be really useful. I remember as a young Christian, Ecclesiastes was so helpful to me. I fell in love with the Beatitudes in the Sermon on the Mount a couple of years ago, and it was really helpful. Different times in your life, the wisdom books will be for different people. What I do know is you can't take it with you. In one day, Job lost what the rest of us will lose, but we will all lose everything. For us who know really old relatives, in effect, they lose everything at the end, and we will lose all our health, and the money won't mean anything, and we lose those things. So we have to be prepared to let things go. Job is cataclysmic because he lost everything in one day. We can't take it. I want to talk about how we can be when people are going through hardship. So the answer is not like Job's friends. So Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar in particular were particularly horrendous. Eliphaz said, "You're reaping what you've sowed." Bildad said, "Your children got what they deserved." How can you say that? So far, if you're sufficiently devoted, if you stop sin and repent, everything will be awesome. Unfortunately, because this is sort of in a spiritual thing, unfortunately, the history of the Old Testament and the New Testament and the churches for 2,000 years is that there is extreme, just like with Job, often a lot of what we suffer can come within the church. And church is full of sinners,
Yeah.
you know? And I know, you know, building work using a brother went badly wrong at one point, and I suffered a great deal of turmoil on that one. We were talking about the end of the Riverside. I started with that. That was really challenging. You know, this was the people I loved, a church that I helped to lead for 2003 to 2012. It was my family. And to see it at the end, we decided to merge, which we felt was the right decision. I do think it was the right, I'm sure it's the right decision. But half the church decided to walk off and walk away. And that was just so hard. And after that point, it was also like, well, what do I do now? I needed to step back, but like, what's my purpose? Having co-led a church, what do I do now? What's my role in church? And it's, you know, men, and we're different. I understand men better maybe, but we need to have a purpose. And I felt like for a long time I didn't have a purpose.
Come on, James.
Come on, James.
And God, how does God feel about this? Well, we know how God feels about Eliphaz and the three friends. My anger burns against you and against your two friends. He's pretty strong. And he talks about them being, Job's going to have to pray for you because of your folly. Now, this is God talking to the three friends. He's fairly strong against it. Well, there's myths of grief. So how can we be what should we say to somebody who's grieving? Just quickly. Well, things we shouldn't do. We shouldn't say don't feel bad. We shouldn't say just replace the loss, go buy a pussycat. I like cats. We shouldn't say grieve alone. That's a bad thing to say. We shouldn't say be strong. We shouldn't say keep busy. You know, there's verses here, I'll send this around. We shouldn't say time heals all wounds. You know, my example is that doesn't work. You know, I was talking about the Riverside, 12 years, and I hadn't dealt with it. You know, there is a fourth friend, Elihu. He does a bit better. At least he says the truth. You know, you're not right. You're not as righteous as you think. That's true. God's words are a mystery. That's definitely true. But he wasn't great. So I think Lamentations, there is actually a good example. In Lamentations, which sort of means mourning, the book, it's the end of Israel. Lamentations is a great book. It's quite hard to read. But in Lamentations, we do hear the voice of a woman who represents the people of Jerusalem. And she says, "For these things I weep, my eyes flow with tears, for a comforter is far from me, one to revive my spirit. My children are desolate, for the enemy has prevailed." She's calling out for someone to comfort her. And there's an answer in Lamentations. In Lamentations 2:13, the comforter is this: "What can I say for you? With what can I compare you, daughter Jerusalem? To what can I liken you, that I may comfort you, virgin daughter Zion? Your wound is as deep as the sea. Who can heal you?" And there's an image I like of, this is what we should be with someone grieving. We should get alongside them and be with them and say, your wound is as deep as the sea. What we are suffering, what we've gone through is unique to us. It's as deep as the sea to us. We shouldn't compare with other people's wounds. That's a wrong thing. We might feel very strongly about something that means less. But that's what we can be, a friend, and get alongside someone and say, your wound is as deep as the sea, and listen to them. Go back to Job. When God speaks, we don't have an answer, but God speaks, and God gives answers. And when God spoke to Job, God asked Job 77 questions in his response. And he said, "Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Behold, Behemoth, which I made as I made you. Can you draw out Leviathan with a fisher? Can you bind the chains of the Pleiades or loose the cords of Orion? Have you commanded the morning since your days began and caused the dawn to know its place?" God didn't answer any of Job's questions. God reminded Job that he was all-powerful God and that Job could just trust in God. And that's what we need to do. And Job responded, "Who is this that obscures my plans without knowledge? Surely I spoke of things I did not understand, things too wonderful for me to know. Now my eyes have seen you." This is Job talking to God. "Therefore I despise myself and repent in dust and ashes." You know, Job's loss is unimaginable, but he is resilient, and we can learn from that. We can ask questions: what have I done to deserve this? Have I sinned? And we ask ourselves these crazy, crazy questions. You know, is God using this? You know, we ask ourselves these questions. We're stuck in this thing. We need to not focus on that. We need to focus on being resilient. And this is something which psychologists have learned, something I read, and I think it really helps me. If a tree grows large and tall and rigid, when the wind and the storms come, the tree is brittle and it will break. And that's what I did when my nephew took his life. And that's what I did at the end of the riverside. But if a tree that remains flexible bends when the wind blows and is able to withstand.
Heart rate zone 1.8.
And so resilience is not the act of being strong, it's the act of being flexible. When storms come, being flexible. We need to find a way, we need to not rely on ourselves. We need to trust in God when things happen. And that was the problem with Job. Job relied on his righteousness and trusted in that, but not on God. We need to find a healthy way to deal with grief. The existence of suffering doesn't mean God has stopped loving us. Grieving, lamenting for suffering is okay. We need to be friends that sit with the grieving and say, your wound is as deep as the sea. We need to find a way to be resilient and steadfast and trust God in the storm. That's it. I have some sources if you want to know more. I rushed through a lot of stuff there. I'll send the notes and the PowerPoint. There is other things. Mohan did a wonderful wisdom literature on teaching day. John Oates, who came here, he's done some sermons on Job. He's done a couple of other things on Job. And I can send you some stuff on wisdom as well. But thank you very much for going for a really difficult topic.